Hello everybody, what's up? You're listening to I Was Just Wondering with Tom Salmon, the podcast that dives into music, film and games and everything else in between. My guest on this week's episode is Peter McCormack, the host of the What Bitcoin Did podcast. Twice weekly, Peter interviews the brightest, boldest and most influential voices in the Bitcoin community. Launched back in 2017, What Bitcoin Did has gained a huge global following over its 283 episodes so far, becoming the #1 Bitcoin podcast in the world. We jumped into Peter's experience of buying Bitcoin for the first time, how Alex Winter's 2015 documentary Deep Web explored the controversies around the trial of Silk Road founder Ross Ulbricht, and what are the major financial pitfalls of the modern financial system, and his love for Bedford Town FC. So, if you're running, stuck in a traffic jam, or sitting behind a desk at work, hope you enjoy my interview with Peter. So just a quick introduction for people who don't know your Bitcoin journalism and podcasting work. Who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me on, Tom. My name's Peter McCormack. I do struggle with the term journalist. It's a really funny term. I tend to find that when people don't like your work, they'll say, "Oh, you're not a journalist. You're just an entertainer." Or when they expect higher standards of you, they say, "Oh, well, you're a journalist. You should do better." And I think this world of podcasting is kind of like a blend of entertainment and journalism, but it started for me by complete accident. Funny enough, about 3 years ago last week. So my background's advertising. I worked in the advertising industry for nearly 20 years, and then got divorced, fell out of love with the industry. I was kind of done by then, and so I took a year off work and stumbled into this Bitcoin world. Had a little go at trying to be a trader, which I wasn't. Well, I made some money, but it was pure luck. I wasn't particularly very good, and by a chance set of events, I ended up spending a week with a quite successful podcaster, a guy named Rich Roll, who's like a vegan ultra athlete, and he was running a yoga retreat in Italy, which I ended up on and spent some time with him and his wife. And when I was out in LA, he said, "Come and visit him." So I did. And I said, "You know what, Rich, I kind of like your lifestyle. I'm thinking of doing my own podcast. I'm in this Bitcoin thing. How do I do it?" And he just gave me all the tips. He said, "This is the equipment you need. This is what you need to do." And I went on Amazon that day, bought the microphones and the setups, and reached out to somebody, did the first interview. And here we are 3 years later, and you and me are talking about it.
So I guess like the big question before we jump into your sort of personal history with sort of like Bitcoin, and it's a question that comes up so many sort of like times, and it's sort of like an interesting one to sort of answer, and each person's got a different sort of explanation for this. So what is Bitcoin, and how do you explain it to people?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. And I'll tell you why it's a really good question, because it is a very hard thing to get your head around to begin with. People hear about it a lot. So usually you hear about it, either there's someone in your social circle who's the Bitcoiner, that person who's into Bitcoin, or you hear about it on the news, and it's either a hospital's IT systems have been hijacked and they want a ransom paid in Bitcoin, or you hear about the price going up or the price crashing, but you don't really hear too much about really what it is, and it takes a long time to get into it. But I think one of the best explanations I've heard, and the one I tend to stick to myself, is I say to people, it's basically gold. It's like gold. We call it gold 2.0, but it's got this magical ability that you can teleport it anywhere around the world. And then that kind of opens up kind of people's ears. They say, "What do you mean it's like gold?" And I explain, well, you think of gold, most people think of gold as jewelry or something that's used in electronics, but actually gold's primary purpose is value. It's a store of value and something that holds value. And you explain to people why it holds value. It's because it's scarce. There's a limited amount of gold in the world, and it's pure. But it's scarce. It's very hard to get hold of. So it tends to hold value quite well over time. Bitcoin is, I explain to them, it's virtually the same. What it is something that is scarce. There's only 21 million of them. And because of that, it holds value. But it has this magical ability. The problem, there's a couple of problems you have with gold, is that it doesn't function very well as day-to-day money, in that, after this interview, you said to me, "Do you know what, Pete? do you want to buy my, I don't know, do you want to buy one of my t-shirts off me? And I'd be like, yeah. I said, well, it's £20, and if I wanted to pay you in gold, I've got two problems. I've got my big lump of gold, which I have to somehow shear a little piece off and hope it's of the right value, and then I've got to get it to you, which means I've got to post it to you. But the great thing about Bitcoin is divisible down to 8 decimal places, so maybe it'd be 0.000325 Bitcoin or whatever, and then you just send me your address and I can send it to you. So it's digital gold it's gold 2.0 for the digital era.
What's interesting about the parallel between gold and Bitcoin, and what's kind of interesting at the moment being in this sort of like space, being in sort of like Bitcoin, is over centuries, there's the idea of the sort of gold myth and what it's been sort of like used for, and people have written about it and lusted after it. And we're the very beginning infancy of the sort of like, in a way, sort of Bitcoin myth of writing a narrative about this particular sort of currency, of what it means and what it can do. And I guess, is that sort of like part of your work, I guess, or like podcasting, is to engage in this sort of narrative and sort of like expand upon it and explain it to people?
Yeah, in some ways. The reason I set up the podcast is because Bitcoin is quite complicated. There's a couple of key areas that are very complicated. One, the technical side, just getting your head around what a decentralized system is and how it works and how you as an individual interact with that. Because being decentralized, there's no customer service. You are self-sovereign. You are responsible for your Bitcoin. And if you make a mistake, you might lose it. So understanding that is quite complicated. The second thing is the economics side to things. I studied economics at school, and it's very much Keynesian economics, which I've come to learn is actually a flawed model of economics. So there's a lot to get your head around. So I made the show as a way just to speak to the experts and ask them questions. I'm more of a creative. I'm happy in the world of marketing campaigns and advertising world. So I just made a podcast where I would just get the experts on and I would say, look, I don't understand this. Can you explain it to me? And so that's what I do, yeah. And trying to explain to people this kind of transitional period we're going through. And it's quite a funny one because, again, I have talked relentlessly about Bitcoin to my friends. A lot of them still just have no interest and don't understand it, where I have so much conviction that the majority of my wealth is stored in it. Despite it being volatile and the price going all over the place, my long-term conviction is with Bitcoin. So it's a lot of my time is trying to understand that and then trying to translate that so it's easy for people to understand it. And it is a big jump, it is a big jump for people to get their head around. But I think it's really important because I always think a good analogy is if you think of CDs and MP3s. I don't know about you, but in my wardrobe here, I've got over 1,000 CDs sat there that haven't been touched or played. I God knows how long, 5 years, 6 years. But I remember when MP3s first came out, I was like, no, I'm not doing that. I want my CD and my inlay card, and I want to hold it, and I want to be able to take my CD from the house into my car and put it in, and for a few years MP3s existed. I even got myself an early iPod, right? And then I would convert my CDs to MP3s and upload it, and then Spotify came along, and I created a playlist and I paid my whatever subscription. I was like, shit, there is absolutely no need for me to ever buy a CD again, and I never did. And I've no need for my CDs. That what possible need do I have for a CD when I can store my entire music collection on my phone and I can access it at any point, in any order, in any location in the world? And this is a very similar thing with Bitcoin, is that gold has been a little bit out of reach for most people because it's just a kind of like a strange concept. Unless you're wealthy or an investor, it's kind of a strange concept holding gold. Well, Bitcoin makes it a little bit more achievable, and it solves exactly the same problem in that I can access my wealth from any place in the world. I can transfer it to anyone else anywhere in the world, and I can access it in any way, and it's divisible in any way I want. So once you start, if you can get your head over the fact that some of the old gold bugs can't get into Bitcoin, and I think it's two reasons. They can't get beyond the fact they can't physically hold it, And secondly, they can't get their head beyond the fact because they think, well, it's used in aerospace and electronics and dentistry, then that's what gives it value, which really it isn't what gives it value. Once you get yourself past that and you realize actually it is far superior to gold, that it's very easy to see why so much money is now going into it. It just takes people a while to get to that point.
So I kind of just want to jump into your leap into Bitcoin. So I understand your first experience of buying Bitcoin was to purchase cannabis oil for your mother on Silk Road. And I just wondered what your point of view on Bitcoin was at that time.
Well, actually, it was before then, but that was my return. So I first discovered Bitcoin in 2013 via the Silk Road. So one of my friends phoned me up and he was like, Pete, there's this website you can buy drugs on. I was like, what? And bear in mind, at that time in my life, I worked in the advertising industry, and I might as well be honest, cocaine was everywhere, and it was something I'd done. It's not something I have in my life anymore. But at the time, I was like, what do you mean? He's like, yeah, look, there's this website, and it's like Amazon. So all the people who are buying and selling are reviewed, so people don't sell crap. And I don't know what your listener base will be like, whether they'd be pro or anti-drugs. I'm personally, I don't care. People can do whatever they want, but whatever they want in their body. I don't believe the government should regulate this. And one of the things I do know is that the war on drugs has failed. And the war on drugs also leads to a harm and higher levels of crime, whereas the Silk Road, the website we're talking about, actually led to reduced harm and took a lot of crime out of the industry, a lot of danger out of the industry. It actually essentially professionalized it. And a good, sorry, I'm just going on a tangent here, a good way to look at this is that if you're a weed smoker, and you wanted to, you want to get a bag of weed, you phone your dealer up, you say, I'll be there in 15 minutes, maybe you'll be there in an hour, maybe you'll meet in Sainsbury's car park, maybe you'll cut you shy on the amount, but it's just, it's a very basic operation. Now it's legal in the US. I spent a lot of time out there. One of my friends owns a store in Colorado. It's so professional now. You go in there, they've got every possible strain you could want. The people who work behind the desk understand it. They, you can say, oh, I want it to chill out. I have anxiety or I have sleeping issues. They'll tell you which one to have. You can buy it as a drink. You can buy it as the weed itself. You can buy ready. It's like going into an Apple store for weed. It's professionalized the industry. And that's essentially what the Silk Road did. So my friend was like, yeah. So I went on and I was like, straight to the menu, and it's like weed, heroin, cocaine, but like Bibles and all kinds of things. Like, and you had to have this thing called Bitcoin. And I said to my friend, I was like, what's this? And he's like, I don't know. It's just like some digital money. You go to this website, local Bitcoins, and you send them some money. They send you some Bitcoin and you use it. And I was just like, this is fucking mad. And so I used the website quite a bit, and I thought it was amazing. What ended up happening, though, is just during that period, I ended up getting divorced, did a bit too much cocaine about that period, and then stopped. And I stopped taking drugs around then. Funny enough, though, I'm very good friends with the mother of the guy who has been sent to prison for the rest of his life for Greater Silk Road. That's Ross Ulbricht. I know his mum very well. I've interviewed her a few times, and that's a whole other tangent we can go down. But what ended up happening then is I quit work, took a year off work, discovered Bitcoin. No. What happened was then my mum got sick with cancer, and we wanted to treat her with cannabis oil. Obviously illegal in the UK because we have archaic drug laws here. And so I said to my dad, I said, remember that coke problem I had? He said, yeah. I was like, well, we can go on that website. Well, not that one because the Silk Road had closed down by then. But I said, there's these websites, but you just need Bitcoin. And so I Googled Bitcoin, found the Coinbase website. We bought a Bitcoin, got the treatment for my mother. Sadly, she passed away, but we but I still had like half a Bitcoin left over or something. I can't remember. And there was this other thing called Ethereum. And I was out of work. I still had money left over from my advertising career. So I ended up buying a bunch of Bitcoin and going deep in it then. So it's a really weird set of events.
That's fascinating. And then, so I was just listening to your first ever podcast interview you did almost 4 years ago with the crypto trader Luke Martin. And
3 years ago. Yeah, it was 3 years. Yeah, 3 years ago. And it was released so what was it, Thursday today? Was it Tuesday? I think it was, the 24th. That was the third anniversary of launching the podcast.
Oh, okay. So, I was sort of listening to that, and in terms of like talking about sort of financial strategy long term in investing, and I guess like so from you diving into sort of like Bitcoin from that personal experience, you know, sort of moving from Bitcoin from being like a dark net sort of like token to a bona fide digital currency. How did that sort of like transition take place for you? I guess for you to see it as more of a sort of serious thing.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So, yeah, I guess what it was in doing the podcast, I just constantly met people and spoke to people. You know, sometimes I would be talking to a technical, but I think my third interview was Jameson Lopp, who's a technical Bitcoin guy, and then I'd maybe meet somebody who's on the economic side, and I kept hearing about this concept of Austrian economics. So spent a bit of time like learning the basics of Austrian economics and learning about what inflation really means, and I'm just like trying to, and you know, I guess what happened was I there's this crossover between economics and like political ideology, and there's lots of people in Bitcoin who are very much anti-government, anti-state. I'm cynical of the state, but I'm not a full anarchist. But there's a lot of libertarians in this community, and I guess I just spent a lot of time with them, and you know, they explained a lot to me about the problems with the state, the ability the government has to print money at will, what the impact that has on everyone else, collectivist ideas of, you know, so some people call it socialism, but it's not true socialism. But I guess we live in that age where people think if you're taxed and that tax is redistributed to poor people, they think that's socialism now. But obviously it's not true socialism. But you know, the criticisms of that, and I was very much grew up as somebody who was happy to pay tax and agreed with the redistribution of income. But you know, I spent a lot of time looking into how flawed the state is, especially with regards to financial managing the financial coffers. I think here in the UK, we can just look at what's happened with the coronavirus and you know, how much money the government spent on on certain issues and the amount of money they're borrowing and the impact that has on people. And I guess I'd got to the point where some people said some like really interesting things to me. Like, we're obviously in the UK, we're huge fans of the NHS. And it's very, very controversial to say the NHS is bullshit. People don't like to hear that. But I think it's a debate that needs to happen. And my own personal criticism of the NHS comes from my experience of spending time with these people and explaining issues to me. Now, I'm not saying let's dump the NHS. What I'm saying is that the problem you have with, like, you and I have to run a budget, right? You either have rent or mortgage and bills to pay, and if you can't pay those, you can borrow money. If you can't end up paying your loans, you default and you can be bankrupt. The government is never essentially bankrupt. They can just almost borrow relentless amounts of money, and if they struggle to pay back their money, then what they can do is they can essentially drive up inflation, which kind of pays it off by devaluing the currency. You know, there's no real penalties for the government for making mistakes, but the penalties happen to us. And if you look broader, other countries that have, you know, really suffered under mismanaged economies. Lebanon recently, there's people who've had their entire savings wiped out through inflation. It happened in Venezuela. I actually went out to Venezuela and made a film about Bitcoin there, and you know, I saw exactly what's happening there, the results of hyperinflation. And it just, I guess what's happened is Bitcoin's got me to this point where I've realized that I'm not completely anti-state, but I think there should be a drive for a smaller state, less government interference, less regulation, less tax. And it's like this thing where people say, oh, we shouldn't have billionaires, like it's a zero-sum game. What we should have is better incentives for people to work and be productive. And so going down this kind of like whole Austrian economic side of things, it's just taught me some of those. Now, I wouldn't be the guy to interview about that because there are experts in that area. But what I've done is learned enough about it to learn that, you know, money can be debased, and the value you think you hold can be wiped out, and potentially the value you hold can be seized from you or in certain ways, and it just makes me want to hold my money and be responsible for my own choices and have less interference from the government.
What I find interesting and something that sort of cropped up as I sort of was doing sort of like research for this interview and in terms of sort of currency, interestingly, so America for a long time, I think maybe like 200 years, they had like competing paper money from private and public banks. There wasn't like a unified currency for the longest time in America, and then suddenly they came up with the dollar to sort of like centralize it. So what's sort of interesting about cryptocurrency that I sort of like find, because obviously you've got Bitcoin and Ethereum and Litecoin and all these sort of altcoins are sort of competing in this sort of like space, that somehow we're so much more skeptical of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, yet the whole, I guess, like the evolutionary process of money has been sort of like competing currencies till one kind of wins out. And we're just in a particular period of history where we're reassessing money and its value and how it's applied to our sort of day-to-day lives and who actually has control over that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The competition for money is important. The competition itself is important. No, this is why it's important. This, the true socialism, where the state owns the means of production, is proven time and time again through history to generally be almost flawed in every instance. I'm sure I'm trying to remember my childhood. I mean, I think I'm a bit older than you. How old are you, Tom? Oh yeah, so you're about a decade younger than me. But I kind of remember the period where where the government started to privatize industries, and that was seen as like heresy. But my understanding is that once you privatize, you should have competition, and competition is good. You want competition in the market. One of the problems with, say, something like the NHS, it doesn't really have competition, and it will always be bailed out. Competition is good. Competition drives better productivity, and that should exist for money too. We should have competition for money, because the reason I hold most of my wealth in Bitcoin is because I believe it's the best form of money there is. When I compare it to, so there's a couple of real standout things to me. It's that nobody can steal it from me. I hold my money. No, I don't have to have a bank account. I hold those private keys. No government can debase it. I mean, I don't know if you've seen our government's debt to GDP ratio is over like 105% now, and the US is like nearly 130%. That gets paid off through inflation, and inflation is a hidden tax. We get almost conditioned to believe in like inflation is a natural healthy part of the economy. It's not. And inflation is a hidden tax. It's if your interest rate is below inflation, which it is, you'd be lucky if you get 0.5% interest rate right now, and we're hitting 2.5% inflation, then your savings are being inflated away. Your hard earned, and you extrapolate that over 10, 20 years, you can see what happens. So I like the fact there's a form of money that nobody can do that to. And I think that makes it far superior. That's why I hold the majority of my wealth in it, but not all of it, right? But I do hold the majority of my wealth in it. And that's the competition for money. And the thing I really love about Bitcoin compared to everything else is that we live in a very complex world. And the financial system itself is very complex. And all the rules of the financial system are created by a group of people in government, essentially, alongside the central bank. Essentially, it's a small group of people trying to create a set of rules that work for everybody to try and keep as many people employed and out of poverty as possible. The thing I really like about Bitcoin, it has a few very simple rules that everybody knows, and it puts the responsibility on you to be productive and to save. Now, I know the basic rules of Bitcoin are there's 21 million of them. That's the first basic rule I understand, and there will only ever be that. Therefore, and then the other really important rule is that every day, through the process of mining, 900 new Bitcoins are issued into the market. And I know in about 3.5 years, that will halve again. And every 4 years, that will halve until all the Bitcoin has been mined. So they're two very basic rules. So I know we live in a society that wants us to spend, wants growth, and expects us to spend. And because of that, it cheapens a lot of things. We have, you go to shops like Primark and TK Maxx, and it's cheap, fast clothes that you can have quick, cheap, and just chuck away. Whereas I actually like a society whereby we're a little bit more frugal. And so in terms of something like Bitcoin, I'm fully aware that because of its limited supply, over time, natural laws of economics, it goes up in value, Therefore, I'm more frugal. I want to earn Bitcoin, and I really don't want to let it go. And it flips the script on everything and puts the responsibility onto the individual, and that I just really like about it.
So just sort of parallel, sort of jumping away from that a little bit, and we're sort of there's sort of like a sort of through line between that and sort of my next question. What did you kind of think about when you saw Alex Winter's documentary, The Deep Web, that focused on the trial of Silk Road founder Ross Ulbricht?
I think he did a pretty good job. It's a story that's very close to me. So it was, I think, something like my 12th interview was his mother, and I've interviewed her 3 times, and we spent time together at conferences. And Ross has also written to me a couple of times. I've written to Ross. It's a very interesting story for me because it takes us back to this point of like, what is the role of the state? Is the state there should the state be there to coordinate things that are best coordinated centrally? Or is it to tell us, a group of people, to tell us what to do? So I like the idea of centralizing. Naturally as humans, we naturally organize in groups. We are naturally collectivists, and that was about survival. If we go back thousands of years, the individual was at risk on his own. So built societies that defended themselves. And from that, societies that work together to be productive, to build towns and such. And at some point, we ended up migrating to this point where we had rulers. Now, I don't mind the state when the state does certain important things. Like, I think, sadly, we live in a dangerous world, and I don't like war, but you need defense, and that's better organized centrally. I also believe certain things like borders are best managed centrally. I think certain things like the roads are better managed centrally. But do I believe a group of people should be sat in a room in London dictating what I should be able to put in my body? Because there's so much hypocrisy, right? We can have alcohol? The most stupid one in this country is that you can have alcohol and cigarettes, but you can't have weed. So alcohol is a far bigger killer than smoking marijuana. It causes a lot of problems in society, abuse, neglect, violence. Cigarettes, pretty much just their only role in society is taxation and death. Whereas there's numerous studies with marijuana that it's proved it's medicinal, and it helps people with sleep issues, anxiety, and all kinds of issues, right? Yet we have a set of rules agreed centrally that says you can do A, but you can't do B. And why is that? Even other drugs, ecstasy. Ecstasy has now been proven to help people with PTSD. There's some move to liberalize mushrooms. I think in Colorado, potentially that's going to be decriminalized or made legal. I can't remember. I think we're going to look back in a couple hundred years when people look back and say, well, what do you mean you were told what you could and can't do? And it's essentially, it's a form of enslavement. So, and the war on drugs has completely failed. It's kind of like a pretty clear that if you, any form of prohibition leads to control by criminals, because there's so much money to be made. Drugs, there's so much money to be made from South American gangs and local gangs. There's so much money to be made in the drugs trade, and they're dangerous trades. My overriding feeling is if you decriminalize all drugs or professionalize them, yes, you have to accept the downside. There are people who will want to smoke heroin, but they want to do that anyway. But what you're going to do is you're going to remove a lot of crime and violence and danger from in the system. And I think the Silk Road proved that, because it went from a point of you had to go and meet some dodgy dealer somewhere where you didn't know if you were going to get robbed, and you didn't know what the quality of the drugs, whether most of the people who die from taking, for example, ecstasy is because of weird impurities. You don't know what you're going to get, and there's like this trail of blood and violence that gets it there. I somebody did cocaine, but I was fully aware of like the criminality behind it. But it's a failed war. What the Silk Road did is it removed that. People, the people who were supplying could professionalize their industry. They didn't have to fight for turf. They could set themselves up somewhere, sell online, and distribute in the post, get paid in Bitcoin. So it's worth looking up the Drug Policy Alliance, because they did a study that how the Silk Road removed violence and danger on the street, both for consumers and sellers. So I absolutely supported it. I'm like a huge fan of the Silk Road. I was like, this is a solution to a stupid problem, which that is based on the historic morality of society that government chooses. So yeah, I fully supported any investigation and any documentary, anything that shines a light on that. I fully support it.
In regards to Ross and his criminal case, so I guess it's interesting because in terms of the people or like the law enforcement or the people sort of surrounded that, what's sort of interesting about the Silk Road is it was this community, and you forgive me, like I'm not 100% on like all the facts, but it was sort of speculated that the Dread Pirate Roberts was a username that was occupied by 3 or 4 different people, and Ross just happened to use that moniker when he was doing more the, I guess, like customer service and kind of things, and to purely pin the whole creation of Silk Road, its management, its coding on one person would be too much, because it was such a sort of vast and sprawling business. So in terms of how he's treated, like he was pinned as being the sort of big sort of like drug kingpin, and as far as I know, he's the only person that's been prosecuted in regards to sort of Silk Road, and also he got a life sentence from that, and I believe from the court case that he wasn't allowed to present evidence that would contradict the narrative that the US government had built against him. And I just wondered what your sort of thoughts and feelings were around that.
Well, it was very obvious they wanted to create an example of somebody. They wanted to scare people off, create an example of somebody who, was making a mockery of the war on drugs. And as such, they prosecute him under I can't remember the actual law, but it's the kingpin rule, right? The same stuff they say for cartel members, Mexican cartel dealers and such. And therefore he ended up with a double life sentence plus 40 years. So he's essentially going to be incarcerated for the rest of his life. I think they wanted to create an example. I think there's lots of flaws in the case. I don't think it's a very interesting thing. I actually asked Lynn, his mum, I said, whatever we think, he committed a crime. What do you think should have happened? And she said, no, I accept that. I believe he committed a crime, and I think time served now should be enough. And I'm of agreement. I mean, no use to society is being served keeping him locked up. But what's very clear is when you start digging into the case, I mean, I'd have to go back because I haven't looked at it for some time, like I admit, but there's just so many flaws in the case. There's certain evidence, the way it's presented, certain evidence that was missing, some of the advice he was given. I think Judge Forrest absolutely wanted to create an example out of him, but there's been so much hypocrisy since. The guy who created Silk Road 2, I'm trying to remember, like I'm sure he got like weeks or something, and he was selling paedophile material on his, whereas Ross had like a moral backbone. It was like his belief was you should buy anything which affords you freedom, whereas other Silk Roads and other dark markets since haven't given a shit. It's just about making money. So yeah, I mean, what I would encourage is anyone who is interested, rather than me trying to like remember things, because like I said, it's been a while since I've looked at the details of the case, is to check out the free Ross website. And there's also a series called Railroaded, which is available on my podcast and available via the website, which will tell you a lot of the flaws in the case. And I just don't, and I think if you're completely anti-drugs, or if you've lost someone to drugs, it's going to be very difficult for you to see the side of the argument. But if you can be dispassionate about it, I think it's very difficult for anyone to believe that any good is being served by society keeping him in jail.
It's just crazy that that they could, that he would get like sort of life imprisonment for that. And I think, because you just think like, okay, so HSBC is known for laundering billions of dollars of Mexican drug cartel money, and there was this huge sort of press conference where they were going to sort of like the US government was going to prosecute them, and they sort of backed out because they didn't realise that would be like the third sort of financial pillar that the rest of the world is based upon, and if you remove that pillar, then we're basically fucked. Basically, if you prosecute HSBC and people like them, they like the world's sort of fucked. Yet somebody who has, I guess, like provided a service which people want, they're engaged in, and has legitimized and actually taken some of the violence out of the drug market. Because I'd say, like, especially with like weed in itself is fine, but it's like how you kind of get hold of it and how it's sort of produced and what that money is sort of used for causes a lot of problems around that. And I guess like formalizing that or knowing where it's going can only improve things for people.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much hypocrisy in the system. I think a great example is if you look at the 2008 financial crisis, essentially the whole world was brought to its knees by poor policy decisions within the US government over multiple administrations, poor advice by the Fed, and greedy Wall Street bankers who created a ticking time bomb through greed. And nobody went to, well, one guy went to jail, I can't remember his name, the guy at Credit Suisse who was basically hiding 100 million in losses, but no one essentially went to jail for that. Yet we had Black Lives Matters protests was triggered by the arrest of George Floyd, who, by the way, is not, I don't need to debate whether or not he's a good person or not. He was using a fake $20 note, and he ended up being arrested and losing his life. And we just have so much hypocrisy in the system whereby the big banks and the big corporates seem to get away with stuff, and it's just hypocrisy all over the place. And it just, and I try to avoid being a conspiracy theorist, which is very easy to do these days, especially with Twitter echo chambers and the crap that comes out from 4chan and QAnon and that. But at the same time, I do recognise there is a them and us with the elites, and there is a lot of hypocrisy in the system, and people get away with stuff which they shouldn't do.
Which is an interesting point, because I would just like to draw, just sort of moving on like a little bit into the sort of more institutional aspect of investing in Bitcoin. So sort of counterpoint the Deep Web film, a year later, Chris, I'm probably going to pronounce his last name incorrectly, but I think it's Kawaruchi's film Banking on Bitcoin looks at the battle to open the first Bitcoin exchange on Wall Street. But just in terms of broad brushstrokes, do you think like mainstream capitalism will ultimately diminish Bitcoin's ability to really change our current financial system?
No, I think Bitcoin can change the system itself. There's this meme that goes around Bitcoiners where they say Bitcoin fixes this. So when you find a problem in the system, you say Bitcoin fixes this. It's the idea being is that a lot of the problems in the world, in a lot of the problems we're going through are rooted in money, and rooted in the control of money. All across the world we have corrupt governments. I mean, how many times do we see situations of corruption in African countries or Middle Eastern countries? That's put out, but the same stuff is happening in Western countries. It's just happening everywhere. There's so much corruption, in the system, and also so many other problems with the money. You want good hard money. You want good reliable money. You don't want money that can be inflated away and printed at will, because the incentive models are skewed. And so actually what can happen is Bitcoin can bring a lot of more responsibility and a lot more honesty into capitalism. I mean, capitalism itself. Look, I'm pro capitalism. I'm not a fan of socialism. I understand some aspects of tax and redistribution, but I think it's better that we move as far away from that as possible. But people who are pro capitalism in the current system are actually pro a skewed system. And a great example of this is during the pandemic. It's worth going to look this stuff up. Obviously, the governments across the world instigated lockdowns, which had just like a very dire impact on certain people's lives and careers and businesses they maybe spent a long time building up. And the way that's been financed is through furlough schemes and huge amounts of money and borrowing from the government. But what's happened during that period is some people have been financially ruined by this. They've lost their businesses. We've seen how many companies have gone into administration. Yet some of the richest people in the world, their wealth has increased during this period. And you only have to go and look at the stock market. If you look at the S&P in the US, productivity is down, unemployment is up, and yet the stock market is setting new highs. What's happening is that this is an inflation of the currency. If you go and actually measure so I always say to people, they say, well, the stock market's doing well. Go look at the stock market measured in gold. When you look at the stock market measured in gold, it isn't doing as well as you think. It's actually dropping, and that's because the value of cash itself is being lost. And this is all to do with a financial system where there are no tight reins on the spending. And I'm not an economist. All I'm doing is repeating things I've heard as best as I can from the interviews I've done. I recommend going to check out a lady called Lynn Alden, and I did an interview with her. She's great. She's really good. But she talked to me about these cycles, these boom and bust cycles we've all heard of. But the idea being is that the government should, during a period of boom, should be running a surplus, and during a bust, should be using that surplus to bail themselves out. The problem is there's so much desire to hold on to power that governments just spend, and they try and spend themselves out of situations. Print more money. How do we fix this problem? Print them. Fiscal responsibility isn't popular with the electorate. So we have huge problems across the financial system because of the money, because it's so easy for the state to print it, and to the misaligned incentives that come off the back of that.
Just sort of moving on, from that, in terms of, I guess, like those sort of key sort of documentaries like the Deep Web and Banking on Bitcoin, and there's Cryptopia. Basically, there's a whole bunch of things, especially around 2014 to 2015, 16. There was just a boom of these Bitcoin documentaries. We're now sort of five years or so away from that, and I understand that you're producing your own Bitcoin documentary called Battle for Bitcoin, I believe. I mean, how far along are you in that creative process?
I got quite far pre-pandemic. We had fully structured out as 10 episodes. It was originally going to be a podcast series, 10 podcast episodes. But what I was going to do is I was going to do all the interviews in person and just have a camera crew with me. So following up from the podcast series, if that was successful and somebody was interested in it, I thought that could be made into either a mini series or a documentary itself, then I would have all the footage to do that. But the pandemic has essentially put that on pause. So my plan is to do something with that next year once we can start flying again and I can go and do the interviews. It's just I just started getting into the kind of idea of becoming a filmmaker myself towards the end of last year. I made a couple of very basic documentaries. I did one in Colombia and Venezuela, which is all about what's happening in Venezuela, and another one at the border between Turkey and Greece during the migrant crisis. Just trying to learn. I learned so much in those few weeks, and I've still got a huge amount to learn. I'd love to become a filmmaker, though.
With your documentary series, I mean, what was the sort of biggest misconception or issues with Bitcoin, and I guess to a larger extent with cryptocurrency, that you're hoping to kind of examine and dispel with this documentary film?
Oh, so that's not really the goal of it. The battle for Bitcoin really is the story of. So one of the interesting things about Bitcoin is it is a blockchain. You hear about the blockchain, and I won't go into the technicals about how that works, but essentially the blockchain exists to stop something called the double spend, which was a problem that needed solving with regards to digital money. What can happen with the blockchain, essentially this chain, is that it can fork. And you've heard about mining. If miners mine both forks, you essentially split it and create two coins. So when you hear about something like Bitcoin Cash or Bitcoin SV, they are essentially forks, okay? It's not the hardest thing in the world to do. There was a time, Bitcoin has a very limited block size. That means every block, which is every 10 minutes we get a new block of transactions, and every block, it has a limitation for the amount of data. It's 1 megabyte. Now, there's been some things that have been done which increased something called the block weight, but I think that's too complicated for now. But let's just say there's 1 megabyte of data possible per block. There are a group of people who believed that the transactions were getting too expensive and wanted to increase the block size. So they wanted to increase it to 2, 4, 6, whatever megabyte. And the reason they wanted to do that is that if there's only a limited amount of transactions that can get into a block, it's essentially the economic supply and demand that set the transaction fee. So during the 2017 bubble, you were paying up to $50 to send a transaction, which is a lot of money. So you can't use Bitcoin to buy a coffee at that point. You shouldn't be using Bitcoin to buy a coffee anyway. But by the by, there are some people who believe that transactions could be super cheap and super fast and therefore needed big block sizes. So there was a huge debate, essentially a war within Bitcoin, where they tried to increase the block size, and it became vicious. I mean, it was a civil war, people attacking each other, arguing on Reddit, fighting about the issues. And then what ended up happening, there ended up becoming a split, and something called Bitcoin Cash was created, and the community split along that. That's essentially what the battle for Bitcoin is. It's that story of what happened during that period, and it's essentially, it will tell the story of Bitcoin to tell that story, but it's essentially the story of that period, because it's a very, very, it's probably the most important time in Bitcoin, the most important event. It felt like a corporate takeover of Bitcoin.
And that's interesting, because I think is it Roger Ver who created Bitcoin Cash? And from my research, I know that you two have butted heads. And I guess similarly, I saw a rather, what was it? I don't know how I would sort of describe it, but a very, I guess, like testy sort of interview, I guess, with like the Hex creator, Richard Hart, I believe he's called.
Yeah, fuck that moron.
Which is...
moron.
I mean, I don't bring it up to sort of like stir the pot, but what I find kind of interesting, and obviously Roger Ver he's featured a lot in the early sort of Bitcoin documentaries, and he's so-called the Bitcoin Jesus. He was sending Bitcoin in documentary for a documentary I saw through a sort of TV screen, and, was sort of evangelical in his love for Bitcoin, but I don't know this person. I only know from what I sort of presented of him. He seems a very sort of like smart individual, but there just seems to be a God complex, and I guess you could say the same thing from what I saw of Richard Hart, this idea of sort of like God complex or God complexes within this particular space. So I guess my question is like, how have you found, I guess, like navigating this sort of like space where the rule of thumb is like, if you haven't retired by the time you're 25 on sort of billions of dollars, you're kind of like past it in a way?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. It is a complicated space full of very strong personalities. Many have been into Bitcoin way longer than me, earned their stripes, been through all the battles. I'll deal with Richard Hart very quickly. The guy's a moron, and everything he's doing with Hex should be ignored, and I just forget that stuff. Roger Ver is an interesting character, and I did fall out with him at some point, but I had the opportunity to interview him early on. I flew out to Tokyo and I did it. There is no denying Roger Ver did a lot for the early days of Bitcoin. He did a huge amount for the promotion of Bitcoin, and that itself is remembered and respected. But he has fallen out with the Bitcoin community because his view is that Bitcoin should be used for transactions of any size. It should be fast and cheap to use. Doesn't matter whether you're want a cup of coffee or want to buy a car. So there's a lot of arguments about that, and he fell out with the Bitcoin community because his view is that it should be doing what Bitcoin Cash is. So he's gone off to do that, and it's become a war between him and other people. And I fell out with him at one point, really badly actually, and we butted heads quite a bit. Recently, I spoke to him again, and agreed to disagree. But like I apologize, and actually I'm involved in a lawsuit right now, and a lot of people don't know this. Actually, I haven't even talked about this personally, but Roger offered to help me out financially with that because it's a lawsuit I could not afford, and he didn't want anything in return. Like there was no ulterior motive. He was just like, I recognize what you're going through. If I can help, I can write you a check and such. But yeah, so there are a lot of personalities, and it's very hard to navigate. One of the biggest challenges is if there's there are multiple narratives that happen with Bitcoin. Economic ones, ideological ones, technical ones, and there's a lot of strong personalities having strong arguments and debates around it. And kind of Bitcoin ends up taking a direction based on those kind of arguments. It gets pushed and pulled in directions, but like my view is whatever happens with Bitcoin was best for it based on these arguments. But if you push too far, you go too wild in some area, you know, you're going to get your wrist slapped. And if you continue, you can become humiliated or, you know, disregarded by the community. You know, Roger's one of those ones now. He's completely fallen out with the whole Bitcoin community. He's doing his own thing. And because his ideas are so far out there, and he was seen as somebody who was attacking Bitcoin. Richard Hart, similar, you know, he's created his own shitcoin bullshit, and you know, and he's been disregarded. And there's other people who are kind of like half and half. There's a guy called Eric Voorhees who I really like. I get on really well with. Strong Bitcoiner, long-term early fan of Bitcoin, but he's very much into altcoins. Most Bitcoiners are very much anti altcoin. So he's kind of like 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Someone like me, I'm fine with him. I get on with him. But there are plenty of people who've, you know, totally disregarded him. So it becomes a real challenge trying to navigate that space. And what I try and do because of my podcast is I still want to hear all voices. I don't believe any amount of discussion damages anything. It can only help. Even I haven't had Roger Ver on my podcast for years, but I wouldn't be opposed to doing it because things can be learned from those conversations. You know, I think people can appreciate, you know, the debate around, for example, if it was block size, whether or not you agree with him, you lose nothing by having the debate. And so I will entertain people on my podcast who other people are totally disregarded, and that gets me shit. I mean, I get yelled at all the time for the stuff I do. So yeah, it is a complicated place to navigate, and it is full of strong and interesting personalities, but that's part of the fun of the job as well.
And just sort of, we sort of talked about it sort of fairly briefly. I was listening to the interview you had with the Winklevoss twins, and they were talking about their approach to Bitcoin and its valuation within the marketplace against oil and gold, and also like market cap. And one of the things, I guess, like that onboarded me with sort of like Bitcoin, I guess, two things I'd sort of say from my own personal experience is that...
Tom, let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question first. Are you a Bitcoiner now?
Yes, so I have. And this surprises people, actually. I was talking to somebody... like 2 days ago, I was just having a sort of like chat and we were talking Bitcoin, and they asked me like, oh, do you have any Bitcoin? And I was like, yeah, of course I do. And they were very sort of surprised because I guess they're still living in that 2015 that if you own Bitcoin, it's a sort of dark net sort of like token. It's not like a proper sort of bona fide financial entity. So I can just briefly tell you my Bitcoin story. And that might be sort of like helpful, I guess, because I guess sharing people's personal experiences, I guess, can only inspire and help other people to sort of join in, and I can say what I did. So I'd heard about Bitcoin for a long time due to sort of like Silk Road and stuff, and friends had been on there and bought stuff, but I'd never sort of dabbled in that kind of thing. So I think finally I'd watched a few documentaries about it, and I guess like the two things that kind of got me was that it's basically the sort of internet sort of like currency or whatever, like it's money that can go virtually anywhere. There's nothing that stops it from going anywhere. Whereas I guess traditional forms of sort of like currency, they're kind of stopped by exchanges and you know, money being able to get there or not get there. But this was a money that could go virtually anywhere. So the market cap basically is the entirety of the world. Which I found really sort of like interesting, and it's also a currency that moved at the speed of the internet, if not sort of like faster. So that sort of really interested me. So I bought just before it hit its first peak. I think it was 3 years ago, like when it hit like £15,000 a coin, and then I just sort of held and went through the dips basically, because I just thought, well, I want to be part of this grand sort of social experiment as well, because I guess I have a sort of ideological attachment to it. The idea of there's 2.5 unbanked people in the world, Bitcoin can facilitate them starting sort of like businesses. I want to participate in that because I'm not actually a proponent of sort of like regular sort of like charity. I don't think that really sort of solves the problem. I'm for sort of incentivization of people doing things and being able to sort of start businesses. I think that's a better solution than just giving people either aid or sort of like financial assistance, because it doesn't give them the means of their own production. And I guess that's a sort of long-winded sort of answer. And then the thing that I would sort of say, which inspired me to have this sort of conversation with you, and it's sort of an odd moment. I was lying in bed a few, maybe like last week, and I was like, why can't I earn interest on my Bitcoin? I mean, I earn interest on my and my pounds and all this sort of stuff. So I did like a little Google research, and then I found BlockFi.
One of my sponsors.
Yeah. And then I sort of read a bunch about that, and I thought that's sort of really interesting. I mean, I've got this Bitcoin that's still sitting there. I'd like to earn more Bitcoin without spending more Bitcoin. So I very quickly transferred I think I had about at the time maybe like 500, 600 pounds worth of Bitcoin, and then I had some Ethereum, and then I had some Litecoin. So I transferred that all over. But then I also listened to your podcast with the BlockFi founders. Forgive me, I can't remember the names at this moment.
Florian, Zach.
So I just found your discussion really interesting, really informative, in also the idea that they're going to develop an ecosystem of financial services around sort of like Bitcoin, which is really interesting. As well. And I guess the thing that sort of stuck out for me, and maybe for you, was the idea when he was talking about, I think it was like blockchain time, the idea that sort of in which the way things sort of the speed of things move, which I found really fascinating. And that's something that I thought about a lot in regards to sort of Bitcoin and the way it moves and how it moves and the speed in which it moves as well. Like it is, it's and I guess in a sort of highfalutin way, it is a new way to sort of like experience time and sort of like currency through the prism of the internet, which I find fascinating. So that's basically my Bitcoin journey in a rather long-winded.
Well, something about the BlockFi, even though a sponsor, one thing you have to be aware of is, yes, they provide financial services, interest accounts and loans based on your Bitcoin. But at the point you use those financial services, you no longer control your financial keys, your private keys. So you do have risk. You have risk with something going wrong with the company. So I always say, if you're going to use them, don't put all your money in there. But they are essentially helping shape part of the financial future. But that's cool that you're in Bitcoin. That's and I guess, and sorry, I know this is your interview, but once you've got skin in the game, you're almost obliged to go down the rabbit hole a little bit, and I think that's when you learn about it. So trying to convince people to get into Bitcoin is really, really hard. I mean, I've been telling my friends for so long, but when you say, look, just go and buy a bit and move it into a wallet and then just go and spend some time learning about it, most people are captivated at that point. I guess you went through a similar thing.
I think, it's like, so I guess the way I sort of like describe it, so there's certain industrial sort of like booms. I guess if you invested in sort of like the car when everybody was riding sort of like horses, and you got into sort of Ford and stuff, you'd have made a lot of money. Okay, great. So, and then I guess like if you'd bought stock in Apple when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were making sort of computers in a garage, you would have made a lot of money in IBM. So there's these sort of like booms and stuff. And I guess like, and I guess like technology adoption as well. That there's people that can kind of sort of like see the future. If it's not going to be that, it's going to be something like that, and actually being able to come on board. And even if even if Bitcoin fails, this is the sort of thing I'm happy that if it just completely goes up in a puff of smoke, the idea of Bitcoin and the principles behind it are sort of like sound, and I think they can be of benefit to the wider world in terms of somewhat addressing some of the inequalities and financial constraints that's been placed in the world with sort of fiat currency and centralized banking. So I guess I see it as a way is that it can improve, hopefully through competition, it might improve or force governments to reassess their own sort of like financial policy, because I don't quite see Bitcoin at the moment overtaking sort of like pounds and dollars in gold, but it can be a sort of agent of change within those sort of like markets, and maybe people think differently about sort of like money and finance.
Well, you say that, but it's like gravity. The thing about Bitcoin, it is like gravity. The more people tend to learn about it, the more of it they want. Like right now, I'm irresponsibly long Bitcoin, and I feel like I don't have enough. And any money I don't need over the next 6 months goes into Bitcoin. I've always got 6 months of like cash reserves for any kind of disaster scenario. Everything else goes into Bitcoin because you can usually ride out the volatility over a long-term period. But if you just track the cycles, we nearly had we had a dip today, but we nearly had a new all-time high this week. We're going to break through 20,000. And we will break 30,000 at one point, and we will most likely, I think, in the next year break 100,000. And because you have to look at someone like Michael Saylor from MicroStrategy, who put $450 million of his company treasure into Bitcoin. He said, I'm on a melting ice cube. This money is a melting ice cube. Where can I get returns right now? I'm going to put it into the best form of money there is and let it sit there. And Square put 50 million in, and this Mexican billionaire put 10% of his liquid wealth in. Like, the more people who do that, the more value it has. And then over time, you will eventually have this. You eventually have this. What do they call it? The tipping point. It's like the book. Think about it like this. Go back to my analogy of CDs and MP3s. There was a time, I still bought CDs and you did, and we would have shops. We'd have Andy's Records or Our Price, where you could go and buy your CDs, and HMV. Most of these stores are closed now. If you go to HMV, it's like a jumble sale. Like they sell records and things, and you've got CDs probably for the top charts, and But most people these days, there's no reason to be buying CDs. The CD industry is almost gone. You could get an absolute tipping point with Bitcoin, where so many people just start putting their money into Bitcoin because they think they see it as a dominant form of money. It ends up killing off sovereign currencies, because why? Especially if Bitcoin, the price starts to stabilize. It's volatile because it's still a small market. Even though it's 350 billion, that's a small market. It gets interesting when it's 2, 3, 5 trillion. Once it gets to that point, it's such a liquid market. The ability to move the price is very difficult. Also, the Bitcoin will be distributed into more and more hands. So what ends up happening is the price becomes a bit more stable, but you will always know that it cannot be debased. So people over time will gradually think, shit, I want my money in that. I want it in the best form of money. Bitcoin's volatile right now, and you can't go from 0 to 350 billion in 10 years without volatility. But just imagine it wasn't volatile. Just imagine it was actually quite stable, and it kept growing in value, but just gradually and slowly. Maybe rather than these big jumps, every week it just went up, say, $100 in value per Bitcoin, and there was no volatility. Where would you hold your money? So I think what's going to happen is over time, we've got a lot of volatility now because it's new and it's risky. And the people who put in their money in earlier, if they're right, are going to be the most rewarded. And those people who come later on because it's a bit risky, it's less risky, are going to see lower returns. But they're still going to be investing under the same principle that there's only 21 million, and therefore basic supply and demand economics plays out. But there will become a tipping point.
So there's something that I wanted to sort of talk to you about in terms of value versus utility that's been talked a lot in terms of sort of Bitcoin and the idea of the Lightning Network and sort of the transactional nature of Bitcoin. So, and I've heard you sort of speak about it, I guess, with the Winklevoss podcast, the idea, and also the BlockFi found as well, this idea of sats, which for people who don't know, I'll do my little best to sort of explain it. So a sat is a Satoshi, and one sat, you're probably going to know this, or you're going to know this.
100 million.
So
think about it they're like pounds and pennies, okay? There's 100 pennies in a pound, there's 100 million sats in a Bitcoin.
So we started, that sort of flicking that switch to say, okay, right, so Bitcoin's the whole thing, but maybe what would make people adopt more if they sort of started thinking about in sats or paying things in sats and stuff, like small denominations of Bitcoin, that might be an easier way in, because I guess when you talk to people, and it's very sort of abstract in a way, you say I'm buying Bitcoin, they think you have to buy a whole coin.
Yeah. You could buy a fraction of a Bitcoin. That's the meme. You can buy a fraction of a Bitcoin.
And that's the thing, and it's so weird that sort of hump to get over, because they immediately see the price of the Bitcoin, and it sort of puts them off. And also, I guess the terminology coin as well. It seems like it should be, coins are small things. They're not large, important things in a way.
Oh, well, only because they've been debased. There was a time where a gold coin was probably worth a lot. It's all down to debasement.
So we just sort of spoke about it a little briefly in terms of the perception of Bitcoin. So the thing that I sort of like struggle with talking with family and friends is basically it's a bubble, it's a Ponzi scheme, it's fake money. Yet I know for a fact people who spent £1,400 on a single Pokemon card on eBay like more than once. So I'd say, and this is, somebody in their sort of like early 20s. So and this is sort of unfathomable to me that essentially somebody would pay that amount of money for a Pokemon card and like the Pokemon sort of like market, yet they're appalled and really put off by Bitcoin. And it's just like, how do you get people to kind of make that sort of like jump? And even like a small one, because I'd say for me, I invest in lots of different things like peer-to-peer lending, like gold and funds and all sorts of stuff. But I also have a percentage of my portfolio in Bitcoin because it makes sense to me to sort of like diversify in a way. And I guess that speaks to a larger sort of like question about just your inherent sort of like financial education in this country is incredibly poor. Yet Marcus Rashford will talk about, rightly so, we'll talk about getting school dinners for people who can't afford them and, the inequality of that. But we don't talk about the inequality of financial education in this country. And I just wondered for you, how would you personally go about maybe improving financial education, I guess, is my long-winded way of asking this question.
Yeah, we have an education system where it's designed by the state, right? Why would they teach you financial literacy, which would teach you everything they're doing is wrong and the game is rigged in their favour? We're taught Keynesian economics, which, if we were to be taught, we'd be taught things like MMT. We'll be taught that inflation is a natural part of the economy. You need inflation because if you have deflation, it's poor for the economy. There's no incentive for the government to teach people the rules of the game that is rigged in their favour. And this isn't conspiracy. This isn't just some like cocked up conspiracy. It just is fact that there is no incentive to teach financial literacy. Even economics is the economics not degree A-level I did, I know is largely flawed in a number of ways. It's also very difficult to convert people into Bitcoin. It just is. I've got the biggest Bitcoin podcast in the world and I can't even convince my friends, right? People will find it when they need it, or they will find it when they have to, or they will just find it at some point or another, and usually through a painful lesson. I've traveled the world with my podcast, and one of the most interesting things was when last year I was in Uruguay, and I sat down with two guys from Argentina. They get it. They get Bitcoin straight away because Argentina has been through so many periods of inflation and the Corralito, and when there was a run on the banks and the banks essentially stole their money. Now, in Argentina, they do not trust the government and trust money. They do not trust the banks. They keep money at home under the mattress. It's very easy to explain Bitcoin to people in Lebanon. It's really hard to explain it to people in the UK and in Western countries because the debasement of our currencies is so insidious and slow. 1-2% inflation a year. Maybe you hit 4%, but we've not had that kind of like 40% in a year. If you were to experience 40% inflation, if you were to go, and suddenly see a pint of beer was suddenly £8 rather than £5. And if you were to go shopping and suddenly, £100 shop now costs you £200. If you suddenly saw the inflation directly happening in front of your eyes, you would get it. But you don't because it's insidious and slow. And that's a problem. But convincing people is really hard.
Yeah, it is, and it's weird. As we've sort of spoken about, they're happy to pay money for a service where you don't own your own music, sort of physically. It's sort of like stored somewhere else, and there's lots of things in our lives that we're happy not to have physical, to sort of physically own anymore. But when it comes to money, people have a very sort of antiquated view of it, and also, from my sort of own research, that when I get sort of like paid, it's only ones and zeros. That are going in and they're just being sort of transferred. I very rarely hold any sort of like cash. So essentially all our money is sort of like digital now anyway, and you're I guess like as you've spoken about, there's one that's basically they can print as much money as they want, and another one there's a sort of finite resource of it that holds sort of like value. So even on just a very sort of like basic level of understanding, one to my mind seems to make a lot more sense.
I mean, what I would say, if anyone's listening to this and they're like, I'm doubtful, whatever, I was like, it's not gonna cost you much to spend a day looking into this. And if you really want to get some skin in the game, just buy £100 worth. You just buy £100 of Bitcoin and transfer it to your wallet. Listen to a couple of podcasts. Learn a little bit about what's happening with the economy and with the amount. I mean, the US is something like 80% of all the money they've ever borrowed has been in the last year or something ridiculous. Just go and look at this. Just go and spend some time. I promise you, very few people who have actually spent the time digging into this have come out going, I still don't believe it. It's the only people, the non-believers I tend to find are people who haven't spent much time because they can't get their head around this concept of a decentralized money that isn't controlled by the state. They can't, there's that. And also the people who discovered it very early on but didn't buy, they usually tend to be really negative because they've got so much regret. Like, it's too expensive at $10, $100. I'm not buying $100, it's too expensive. And then $1,000. And then they become very cynical and very hateful of it. But there's a very good interview I did with a guy called Vijay Boyapati called The Bullish Case for Bitcoin, which is entirely based on an essay he wrote about money and Bitcoin. It's worth checking it out. And I've also, on my podcast, I've got like a 17-part beginner's guide that will teach you all about money and Bitcoin. It is worth investing the time. It is definitely worth investing the time.
So I just have two final questions for you before you wrap up.
Sure.
And I love these. I think this is so interesting to be able to sort of like listen back as well. So I'm going to ask you your 3 big predictions for Bitcoin in the next 5 years.
Oh, good question. 3 big predictions. Well, I don't like doing price predictions, but at the same time, I do believe certainly over the next 5 years, we will see a Bitcoin over $100,000. I'm very, very confident of that. Every model I've looked at is pointing in that direction. So that's prediction 1. Prediction 2 is we are going to see a big challenge to Bitcoin coming from the state at some point. Once a lot of money starts getting swallowed up and people realize that Bitcoin is a dominant form of money, that is a threat to the state. That is a threat to government. That is a threat to their control of finances. Now, depending on which country you're in, the response will be different. I mean, it's already kind of banned in China, and I'd expect Russia will possibly do the same, and maybe India and Brazil, those more kind of authoritarian countries. I think in kind of modern Western liberal democracies, it's going to be much harder. I think the state will find it difficult to do that, which will kind of start splitting the world into pro-Bitcoin and con-Bitcoin countries. So that's something I would be keeping an eye out for. The other big prediction I would put is, it's not a Bitcoin prediction, but it's a prediction related to Bitcoin. I think over the next 5 years we're going to see the failure, or relative failure of a significant Western currency, whether it's the dollar, the pound, the euro. And when I say failure, I don't mean it's going to collapse in the way people think, but we will see high inflation and therefore massive debasement of the currency. It could be that the US dollar note is no longer the world reserve currency anymore. I don't really know, but I would say keep an eye on that, because that will drive money into Bitcoin.
And finally, what's your dream project if money and time wasn't an issue?
I think you know this. Have you done your research? Do you know?
Oh, that's a great question, actually. Oh, actually, I'm going to say, for argument's sake, I don't.
Right, so there's 2. Like, I really actually want to be a filmmaker. So let's just put that one out there. I've always, ever since I was a kid, and it was just one of those things I never thought actually would be possible. I just don't know how people do it. And then I, saved some money, and traveling with my show, I brought a camera guy, and we made a couple of films, and I think they're a bit shit, but I learned a lot. I would eventually like to become a filmmaker. Like, my goal is maybe 10 years time, when I hopefully made enough money off the Bitcoin thing, I can just go and become a filmmaker. And I would love to do it. But perhaps I'll call you up and say, Tom, how the fuck do I do this? My other thing I really, really want to do is I want to become a Bitcoin billionaire, which probably won't happen. But I would like to buy Bedford Town Football Club and get them in the Football League.
Yep, I knew it.
I thought that's why you'd asked it, because I've always said, like, I always told my parents, because I support Liverpool, but I'm from fucking Bedford, mate. You know what that's like. I always wish we'd had a team. Well, like, for the size town we are, we should have a decent team, and we're not. We're in the lowest of low divisions. So I always said I was going to buy Bedford Town and get them in the Football League, and that's still my goal. It's still my goal, Tom.
Because for people who don't know, who are listening, Peter and I are both based in Bedford, which is I guess like a smallish sort of like commuter town, which is about 45 minutes outside of London on the train. And I guess what's fascinating having this sort of interviews that somebody who has the #1 podcast, Bitcoin podcast in the world, lives in Bedford. It just completely blows my mind.
But yeah, that's funny. How funny is that though, isn't it? Like, it's just a funny. I'm very pro Bedford, and I always big up Bedford on the podcast. And I think people are always like, "What is this funny town?" But I'm being, how funny.
Just quickly, how can people get in touch and get in contact with you and find your podcast?
Yeah, so, I actually have 2 podcasts. So there is the Bitcoin show, which is What Bitcoin Did. Just search for What Bitcoin Did, you will find that. I have another show called Defiance, where I kind of touch on other subjects. I did an investigation into Ghislaine Maxwell, doing a series about Donald Trump kind of at the moment, and range of things there. And just reach out to me on Twitter. It's at Peter McCormack. And my DMs are open, happy to talk to anyone. And listen, once this lockdown is over, let's go and grab a coffee sometime.
So there you have it. I had a great time chatting with Peter, and you can check out the What Bitcoin Did podcast on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify and YouTube right now. Just click the link in the description box below. And don't forget to check out more great content on aruba.com, from film reviews, video game hot takes and top 10 videos. And why not sign up and become a member and share your passion for all things entertainment on aruba.com today? And you can like and subscribe to I Was Just Wondering with Tom Salmon on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify and YouTube. And maybe leave a comment or review if you like. And you can support the podcast on Subscribestar at www.subscribestar.com/I Was Just Wondering with Tom Salmon right now. Thank you so much for listening. I've been Tom, and I'll catch up with you next episode.